The map we're going to talk about today is Serengeti, a map characterized by its heavy aggression and big focus on mobility due to the open woodlines and exposed resources. With that aside, hello True. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get into more specific questions, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your experience with Age of Empires 2?
Sure. Hello, guys. And thank you for having me here. Been a while since I've had an interview, but so my name is Kellen, but I go by True in Age of Empires. I was a longtime deathmatch player, having won the DM World Cup back in 2016 before Viper won the rest of those. So yeah, most of my history goes back in deathmatch, but I do play RM here and there. And overall, I've just been a huge Age of Empires 2 advocate and enthusiast throughout the years. And more recently, I actually started working for World's Edge, and I'm currently a data scientist for World's Edge, working on the Age of Empires franchise.
That's really incredible. So, the map Serengeti has always been a popular pick in the deathmatch community. Could you tell us a little bit about why that is, and what it is about the design of the map that makes it so suited towards that aggressive late game play that we see in deathmatch, and what it means for random map players trying to get a feel for it?
So Serengeti, which came out when DE first came out back in the end of 2019, was an instant hit in DM. Like DMers loved it. You could quote Jidba, who used to be like the number one deathmatch player forever. When he first played Serengeti, he said, "Okay, this is the new DM map." He loved how open it was, extremely open. The trees even have cracks in them a lot of times so that you could run through them. You even have to be careful with the terrain. The cracks in the terrain could lead to buildings being placed on them or being destroyed a little bit easier. So there's it's kind of multifaceted. The gold mines are usually stretched out around the edge of the map. A little bit harder to control them with like hills. You can't really wall yourself in at all. And so therefore the map, just its open characteristics along with just how the gold mines are separated and those wood lines and even the cracks in the terrain, all those things make for a really interesting deathmatch map and overall very open map for any kind of playstyle or any game mode.
So it's kind of the totality of all of that coming together that makes the map the way it is and makes the playstyles on that map the way they are.
Exactly. And I think there's a lot of, it's multifaceted. There's a lot of different ways to approach a map like that, especially in RM, where you have to consider whether or not you can even wall your map. So yeah, it's a very interesting map. I think it doesn't get played enough. It's a personal favorite of mine, being a deathmatch player. And yeah, it's gonna be great to see it in your tournament.
So, now given your experience with DM, what advice would you have for players about approaching the Imperial and post Imperial age?
So as everyone knows, deathmatch being in the post-imperial age, it does focus entirely on that late game. Is how people think of it as in terms of RM, right? The late game, like in RM, is very similar to deathmatch. So how to approach that? And in DM, a lot of times you'll notice players going for a critical hill. Now, if you look at the map, generations of Serengeti, sometimes you have gold mines that are like stretched out on both sides of the map, but sometimes they're all concentrated on one side of the map. And when that one side of the map has a major hill that controls the majority of those gold mines, you want to be the first one to control that hill. So, a lot of times in what we've seen from Arabia in the past years in RM, there's been this big hill right in the center. And so it was rather obvious that, okay, I want to castle that hill. That's like the strategy. It's a little less obvious in Serengeti because half the time you don't have any hills there in the middle to go take in the first place. So then where do you drop a castle? Where do you set a base? Where do you defend? Like, what's the key locations to try to defend and control? It's a little less obvious in Serengeti where players may be a little bit, going for just directly at their opponent's base, but it might be wise to instead go on one of the sides, especially when all the gold is concentrated on one side.
So there's a much wider focus overall on the map in Serengeti as opposed to something more standard like Arabia.
Exactly. In Arabia, you usually, at the beginning at least, have to scout around your base. You collect your sheep, you look for the critical resources, whether or not your gold is forward or not, a good couple of wood lines. Then you run over to your opponent's base, you scout what he's building, look at whether or not he's going to drush or if he's walling up, etc. Take a guess at what his build order is going to be. And then you might not really consider looking around the map much more after that, unless you're looking for, let's say, relics. Now, a DMer approaching it, though, is going to be really curious to see where are those gold mines concentrated on the map? What are the critical areas to control for the late game in order to win a game in Serengeti? And so I think a step above the usual way to play RM, or at least the usual play like in Arabia, would be to take that extra little bit of time after you've scouted your opponent, if you can afford that time, to actually go scout one of the sides. Just by scouting one of the sides, it could give you a lot of information. For example, it could tell you whether or not all the gold is going to be concentrated on that side or not, given that the amount of gold mines generated on Serengeti is always constant. And it could tell you whether or not there's a key location there that you want to end up taking in the long run. Your opponent will run out of gold mines to mine in his base, just like you will. And so controlling that key side, especially when all the side is, or on one side controls all the golds, will definitely lead to a victory. And so I think that can add an extra element that you won't see in a lot of the other maps in this tournament.
That makes a ton of sense. So, on top of obviously needing to scout all that, do you think the fact that the map is so spread out like that and so exposed like that is a big part of what makes mobility so crucial?
But mobility is critical, especially, yeah, I mean, typically when you see an open map, you think mobility is amazing. And obviously, mobility is amazing here. However, tends to be a fair amount of wood lines that do get generated in this map, so it's not like mobility is going to serve you as well as you would maybe think in Serengeti. But the fact that you do have more hunt does serve a civilization, let's say, as Mongols, which does tend to also be very mobile. So I do think in your tournament, in this tournament at least, there will be a lot of mobility just because it suits a lot of the civilizations that people want to play to take advantage of things like the extra hunt. Um, Overall, though, I don't know if mobility is exactly needed so much, or at least it may not be as needed as you would think.
That's really interesting because I definitely think there's a different, I guess, preconception to the map typically about that.
Right.
So, you mentioned Mongols already. Do you have any other civilizations that you would kind of recommend? And especially ones that would really suit a new player who's trying to get a feel for the map and try and get comfortable with the settings?
Well, as we all know, new players tend to house themselves a lot, and so a natural pick for an open map that will prevent them from getting housed would be Huns. And it's also kind of a DM favorite to go Hun Wars, and Huns is just a favorite overall. So I would say Huns is a great choice. Obviously, Mongols is another great choice. Um, but I'm sure there's got to be a lot of other good choices to be made out there. I would even venture to guess Sicilians could be a good guess or a good choice, just based on like, if you could place clever town centers in key locations, they build the town centers quicker. Um, that might be an option to like kind of boom your eco. Maybe even using the donjon if necessary. I'm not really sure if that's really applicable here, but overall, there's multiple strategies that could probably be developed on this map. I'm sure most of the players will probably end up just using pretty standard Arabia kind of tactics. Um, Arabia meta will be pretty similar to how you might develop meta in Serengeti. But again, I do think that if players just look for like key pieces on the map, whether it be a hill in a key location, where those gold mines spawned, those kind of details will lead to an edge for one player in all of your games.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's like the step beyond, just basic RM is to really pay attention to the map, scout it all, and make sure you're controlling it effectively with your army and using your civ bonuses to get control.
Right. So a new player trying to learn how to do all these things, it's like if you could take some of that emphasis away from building houses, why I'm saying Huns, it allows a little bit more freedom to look at things like the map, and which might in turn lead to some advantage.
That makes a lot of sense. So, any, I guess, final thoughts?
Oh, it's nice to have you guys doing a map like Serengeti in your tournament. It's definitely been a big favorite for the deathmatch players, as you mentioned. It's also nice of you guys to look for me for some of my thoughts on Serengeti. I'm sure some people who listen to this may not feel that it's normal to have a deathmatch player do an interview for an RM tournament, but I'm glad to provide some insight wherever I can. And yeah, I'm really hoping you guys have a successful tournament.
Yeah, you've been super helpful. Thank you so much, man.
Yeah, no problem.